Hello everyone, welcome to benchmarking of Assassin's Creed Valhalla with RTX 3080, and as I've promised in the title, gain up to 20% FPS, which at around 50 FPS average, it is a pretty big deal to get from 50 to 60. I think it's a great thing. I'm gonna put the exact specs of my system, but just to be clear, the GPU I have is NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3080 Tough, and the CPU is Ryzen 5 5600X, and the RAM I have is Viper 16 gigabyte, and it's set to 4000 megahertz for the speed of the RAM. So I'm gonna show you, so I've turned off the VSync off so that the FPS can go higher than what monitor can basically handle, because I'm a 4K 60 FPS monitor, so above 60 it also gets to 64, but above that it doesn't really matter. So for graphics, I set the default to test what it looks like at the default of ultra high. It's gonna set everything maxed out, and let's see what FPS do we get. It's a bit lower than 52. Do not look at this average. I was testing a few things before starting to record. So I'm not going to do a battle scene because there's going to be a lot of variance in battle scenes. That's going to be a bit hard to do, benchmarking on. But a place like the settlement, that is pretty heavy environment, that's going to be, I think, a good place to do. So this is at night, and you can see that basically if you get to crowded area in buildings, you can say it's around 45 to 47. It drops a bit below 45, but it also goes up to 47, 48 pretty often. So I'm gonna go to the morning, because there could also be some difference in the morning and the night, depending on the number of people around you and how much computations the GPU needs to do. So you can say that with the default of ultra high, you can guess that in battle scenes that your average is going to be around 45, because this is not as busy and as heavy as a battle scene. So these are a bit higher than normal. In a settlement, it's still not going to be that crowded with the environment. Now I'm going to show you a couple of things that you can do, and I'm going to keep walking around in the same place, and you can see how the average FPS can be boosted up by a few changes that doesn't really affect the beauty of this game, I would say. Like, the environment of this game is just amazing. I love all the coloring. So let's start to do that. Also, just a heads up, you might see some jumps in the video. This is not me doing anything tricky or anything. Some of the changes might require the game to restart, so I'm gonna cut the video at those times. So also, these are something that I actually looked up from Hardware Unboxed page, so this is not me playing all over with these things. I did look at them after I got these suggested settings from Hardware Unboxed, but these are not something that I came up with. I gotta give the credit where credit is due. And you can see that with the graph, the average was 49, but it was also affected maybe for a few seconds before that, but we can trust that the average is less than 50. That's, I think, something that we can agree on. Now, the first thing that I think you can just turn off, and it doesn't really matter, it's the motion blur. And like, some people might not even like motion blur to be on, but let's see how much just the motion blur is gonna affect the game. As you can see, with just the motion blur, you are not dropping below 50 FPS. So you can say that you've already gained 3-4 FPS with just the motion blur. Let me get on the horse and see. Okay, so maybe I should have tested with the horse too, because it makes it a bit faster. but with the horse it is still not dropping below 47. So motion blur is one of the things that you can just turn off, and it already gives you like half of the thing that I've promised you already. 3 to 4 FPS at around 50 is pretty big deal. At around not 50 even, 47-ish. Now that's the first thing that you can change. Now the second one, and just to be clear, we're at 4K. I'm not gonna do 1440p in this video, but if you're interested, let me know in the comment section. I'll do a separate video on 1440p, because if I try to attach two different resolutions to the same video, it could mess up things a bit, and you might lose some of the details in the video. Now, the second thing that you can change is if you go back up top, this is something that Hardware Unbox suggested. I'm not sure, actually I'm not gonna do any adaptive quality right now. They suggested to put it at 60 FPS. I'm not gonna do that. The next thing that you want to change is anti-aliasing, and it seems that this here shows pretty big difference. Like you can see that it kind of gets a bit blurry in this image, but in the actual game the effect is not that much. So let's apply that. I honestly cannot see any difference. It could be that you have to, you know, go close up, look at an object from up close to be able to pick that up. But otherwise, I don't really think that it has a big effect, and I myself am willing to sacrifice that too. And you can see that we're almost at around 60 FPS, so that was another, what, 2-3 FPS I think? And if I go up top, that this place is a bit less crowded, so we are going from a maximum of 50 with the default ultra setting to a maximum of around 60 FPS. And when you get down here, which is a bit more crowded, you get to that 55-56 FPS. So we are kind of halfway there to the 20% that I promised that you can gain with tweaking a few of the settings. Now, what are the other things that you want to change? World detail, this is something that you can, you know, decide on what you want to do. Hardware Unbox suggests that you can, I'm gonna put a screenshot of those settings from their webpage at the end of this video if you want to take a look at it. They suggest you can go to very high, and you can see some main changes. Like for example, there is a bush here that at ultra high, you know, it has a lot of more leaves and stuff, but if you go to very high, it loses those details. And I don't think that there's much of gain here if you go to very high. I'm gonna give it a try, and this is one of the parts that's gonna need a restart. So let's take a graph here. So we've got to the average of 58, I think from 55 it was. So I'm gonna restart the game, get to the very high, and ooh, it did not let me do that. The game needs, start the game, yeah. Okay, so coming back to world details to be very high, and I'm not gonna change clutter. This is even something that Hardware Unbox suggested, that there's not much of a gain with changing this one. And you can see there's some changes in the thickness of the bushes and stuff on the ground. I think it makes the world more beautiful, so I would also recommend leaving it as maximum settings, which is very high, not ultra high. But with the world detail going to very high instead of the ultra, as you can see, there's not really much of a gain. I myself would probably just put it to ultra, because 1 or maybe 2 FPS is not really that much gain, and the world detail is gonna mostly be affected in the open areas. I'm gonna go to some open areas and try to do some fight scenes between two major different settings with the optimized and non-optimized to see how it changes. But the world detail is gonna matter probably more in the open world area, not somewhere in the like the settlement that you don't have many trees and stuff to take that effect into account. But now if we look at the graph, so from 58 FPS we've got to 60, but we also have some huge peaks that really doesn't make much of a sense. Sometimes there is some FPS drops. And also, just to remember, I'm not doing any sort of boosting of the GPU, and the temperature that you're seeing, there is a tiny bit of an issue in the airflow of my case. Technically it should not be above 70 degrees, so ignore that. This is something on my part. And again, I'm not doing any sort of boosting to the GPU itself. This is something that it's doing all by itself. And the next thing that you can kind of sacrifice, I would say, is the shadows and volumetric clouds. I'm gonna do this both at the same time because they both have some tiny effect, but I mean, you can sacrifice these two to get the world detail back to ultra. But for shadows, you can see that between like high and very high, there is some sort of a sharpness around the edges of the shadow, but it's very tiny. Like there's not much of a difference between even going to medium, low. It does kind of change. You can say that the shadow is not that dark, and it's the same thing with very high. Going from ultra high to very high, the shadow kind of loses a bit of its color, but you're not going to be noticing this very much. So let's go to very high for the shadows. And the second one is the volumetric clouds. This is also something that I would really recommend changing because you can't see really much of a change. If you go to medium, the clouds suck. Like it's just a bunch of stuff in the sky. So definitely not that. But between high and very high, you can still see that the clouds look better at very high. At high, you don't see much of a structure here if you look at the clouds. But when you go to very high, now you begin to see some kind of an internal structure to the clouds. But if you go from very high to ultra high, the only difference that I can pick up is that it seems that the edge of the clouds seem to be a bit sharper, but I'm not really sure. Like I cannot tell much of a difference because it seems that there is some change in the scene itself. You can see, for example, the shadowing down here changes from very high to ultra high. So it could be that it's doing some lights passing through the clouds at ultra high, but I don't think that you're really gonna notice this in the game, that hey, I'm not getting some sunshine on the ground. So let's put this back to very high as well and apply the changes, and it needs another restart. Okay, so with the shadows and clouds set to very high instead of ultra, now the average is finally getting above the 60 FPS. Now, just a heads up, I'm gonna keep running around so you can see the FPS, but I gotta give you a heads up that if you don't have V-Sync or G-Sync, that you can get, somewhere between 30, 45, 60 FPS, and your monitor is not gonna just, shrink it down to the closest that it can support. You might have to, switch down a few of the settings a little bit more to be safely above 60 FPS, so that when you get to places that it suddenly gets heavy, like a battle scene, which I will show at the end of this video, you still are above 60 FPS, because if you drop below 60, your monitor might put you down to 45 or even 30, depending on what sort of monitor you have. But if you have V-Sync on, you can just turn that the V-Sync on and you're good to go. It doesn't matter if it drops below 60, but you can see that in this area it's mostly above 60 FPS, and I'm moving the camera around, I'm not letting it sit still. And when it gets a tiny bit less crowded, it completely is above 60, and you can see that the average is also at around 61 FPS. So the other things that you have is water. I would let it be at high. This is again something also HUB suggests, like between medium and high. It's mainly at the shore that you can see the difference, not really somewhere in the middle of the water. There's also some changes in the reflections, but some minor changes I would say, but there's some changes at the shore, so leave it at high. I would say there was not much of a gain changing water to medium. Then you also want to have this one on definitely, so you, at least you get some sort of reflection. It's not ray tracing at all, but you at least get some reflections from the waters of the, you know, the rivers and some puddles around the world. That would be something that you would like to have. For environmental texture and character texture, definitely let them be as high as you can, because that's the whole thing. Like, you're playing at 4K to get awesome texture, and there is a huge difference even between low is for 2000 games. Like, this is terrible. Between medium and high, there's still, the image is much sharper, so definitely put this at high. Do not sacrifice anything here if you don't have to. You know, if you don't have a 3080, I don't know how it's gonna look like on 3070, for example. But as long as you don't have to sacrifice environment texture, don't do it. And the same with the character. I wish that they had shown the face, but even just the clothing and the shield and everything, there's a huge difference. Like, low is just terrible. Look at the shield and the marking on the shield. Then medium, it gets a bit sharper, and at high it's much sharper. So definitely leave the character texture at the highest one, which is just called high. For depth of field, which is all objects, if you put it off, all objects appear in focus. So this is something that you decide. Like, if you really want to get a feeling of further objects are actually appearing to be a bit blurry, you can put it as high, or you can put it completely, like, this is something that you can decide that I'm willing to sacrifice this thing because everything is just going to appear sharper, right? If you don't mind, like, it's not totally realistic. HUB suggested that it can be on low because there's not much of a gain between low and off, but there is a difference between high and low. So I'm going to put it on low as well and give it a go, and that's going to basically be our last check. This one does not require any restarting. So at the top of here, we were hitting 65 FPS when I got here. Yeah, you see, even that one is still not giving us much of a gain, but it could be more important when you get to more crowded areas. So I would just put it on low because it's not something that's gonna reduce the quality of the game. It might not just be as realistic as a real world case, but you know, it still is gonna, actually objects are gonna look better because they're not gonna be blurry if they're further away from you. But if you don't like it, you can put it on high if you want to, but if you have a bit weaker GPU, you wanna consider doing that. And if we go to the graph, I just need to give it a few seconds running around, changing the camera so that it's not doing one scene, because if I just don't change the camera much, you usually get higher FPS than, you know, rolling the camera to different places. And the average is at 62, so like 1 FPS is really hard to tell if it's just the error and uncertainty of your measurements or it's actually the effect of that. So as the last check, I'm gonna go to the a place that is completely open world, not the settlement that's crowded, to see, just to show you that like that's almost the worst case scenario. Not absolutely, you can run into assaults that are, you know, much more crowded areas. But when you go to open world, you're way, with these settings, after optimization, you are way above the 60 FPS. That for me is the sweet spot. Like Assassin's Creed is not an EA game that you would need 100 FPS, 120 FPS gaming. 60 FPS, I'm more than happy. If I could do a game at 4K, 60 FPS, I'm totally happy, and Assassin's Creed is one of those games. So yeah, in open world you can see that we are well above 60 and we are at 70 FPS. Now this is with kind of the almost optimized, because I'm gonna put the world details back to ultra high, because I'm willing to sacrifice 1, 2, 3 FPS at around 60 when I have the VSync on to have more details on my world. But if we go back to the absolute ultra high, let's see how much we get affected even in an open area. So I'm gonna go to the graphics and let it be at ultra high. It's gonna need a restart. Okay, so we are at the ultra high graphics quality and in the same exact location that we tested the optimized setting. And you see that even with the open area, we are well below the 60 FPS. Not well below, like 5, 6 FPS below 60, but still, we cannot even reach 60 FPS in the open world. It barely hits sometimes 60 FPS, but I would say I would call the average to be around 55, while we had an average of 70 FPS with the optimized one. So yeah, you can really get about 20% boost to your FPS in most of the cases with just tweaking a few of the settings that does not really affect how the game looks like. And the most important ones are the motion blur and anti-aliasing. And let me know if you can spot any differences between these two settings really. You know, it's the same location, like on the horse, going around. I honestly cannot spot any differences. And the sun is gonna change location and stuff, so the sunshine on the ground could change from one part of the video to the another. But other than that, the world looks amazing to me and I don't really spot any difference. And if you look at the average, it's around 56. I forgot to save the average of the previous one, but it was around 70 as we saw. Now I'm gonna go ahead and try to get myself into a battle scene. This is the ultra setting, so let's see how the ultra setting work in a battle scene and how does the optimized one work in those cases. Alright, so unfortunately I don't have any solved mission at hand to test the FPS assault, but I think doing a raid is as close as we can get to a heavy battle scene. Ooh, this is actually also a hard level location, so let's try not to die. But still, you can see that it's not that really bad. I think this is the ultra setting, just keep note of that. I'm gonna mark the video and put timestamp so you can know which part is ultra and which part is not. And yeah, I think it's safe to say that the average is around 50 in semi-heavy battlegrounds, or 50 plus. Ooh, I have a lot of enemies here. Okay, so I'm not trying to play the game. I think this should give you a sense of the FPS in your battle scenes. You can expect something around 52 if you want to be a bit generous with the game, but it's closer to 50 in the battle scenes. Now I'm going to do the same location with the optimized setting. So just to make sure, the average, yeah, me being generous was more realistic, so around 52 average FPS, and as you can see, the graphics is at ultra high. So I'm gonna set the settings. That I'm gonna change anti-aliasing to low, the shadows to very high, volumetric clouds to very high. I'm gonna leave the world details at ultra high. This is something that HUB suggested to be very high instead of ultra, but this is something that I prefer, but this is something that you can definitely do a little bit of a sacrifice on that. And then depth of field to low and motion blur to off, and I'm gonna do the same battle scene and see how much of a change we can get in the average FPS. Okay, so this is the same battle scene now with the optimized settings. Just want to get away from that dude. He's pretty high level for me, so I don't want to keep on recording and keep recording the same scene. But like, this is kind of not as busy as it gets. Definitely the assaults are going to be more crowded, but I think this is a good test. We have had the settlement, we have had the open world, and now a raid with quite a lot of characters moving around, fighting, scenes getting to be slow motion, fast paced and everything, and still looking pretty good. Like, I have not, I'm trying to not to die, but I have not seen it drop below 60. There are a lot of jumps, that's for sure. I think that's something that we do expect in these things. It's gonna jump all over the place, especially with the finisher parts, which you've done already. I just fall down. That wasn't good. But yeah, that's gonna be how. And honestly, I still cannot see much of a change from the quality of the game. So those sacrifices to me are definitely the gain. And I guess that's gonna be enough for the showcase. I'm gonna put the graph up and let's see how much we have. An average of 68. Like, that's insane. From 52 to 68, that's how much, like more than 30%, I guess. This is not realistic. There are a lot of jumps high, but you saw the FPS at every moment, and it was not dropping below 60 even at a raid like this. So I think when I use the ability, of course the FPS is gonna go a bit higher, but it still is not dropping even once. Maybe I've missed a frame here trying not to die, but I've not seen it even once to drop below 60 FPS. And again, at 4K, if I can get the 60 FPS, I am more than happy. Okay, so I'm gonna put the timestamps in the video if you want to look at something specific again, and I'm gonna put a conclusion to this video. So, recording does not affect the FPS. If I turn on the camera, it's gonna have a huge impact on the FPS, around 20%. I've tested this before because I do a lot of walkthroughs, and I've recently decided not to have the camera on because it gets a huge hit on the FPS. So the recording is not affecting the FPS because at 4K you don't get CPU bounded that much, and the CPU can do most of the recording stuff. And the GPU that I have is more than capable of, you see, it's at even this much. It's using 6.5-ish gigabyte out of 10, so it can do the recording no problem. And so just wanted to make clear that the recording is not going to affect the FPS. The other thing is that I'm gonna put the screenshot in the end, but just remember that one thing that I did not change myself is the world detail, because I preferred it to be at ultra high. Also, all of the settings that we tested here, again, were at 4K. If you would like to see a similar thing or just a shorter version at 1440p, let me know in the comment section. I will try to cover that one as well. And again, we had the VSync off, so the game would get whatever FPS it wants. Your monitor might not be supporting that, but for the showcase, I needed to turn this one off. Otherwise, I usually turn it on to cap it at 64, which is the native resolution and refresh rate of my monitor. The last point that I could mention is that you also notice that in that screenshot, adaptive quality is set to 60 FPS, but I just had it at off. This is something that, you know, highly depends on what you prefer. You can put it, it's not gonna give you any gain to the FPS, I would say. It's just gonna, you know, make the refresh rate more consistent. It's gonna try to keep it at around the point that you want to set. So you can go with 45 or 60 FPS. I think most 4K monitors can do 60 FPS, so you can go with 60 FPS to try to get it more stable so you don't get all those jumps. It tries to keep the refresh rate at 60 FPS. So if it drops, it's gonna try to change the resolution a bit to get back to 60 FPS, and if it's higher, it's not going to use that much resource, and it's just going to put the FPS down at 60, which again, if your monitor is 60 FPS, that's like okay. It doesn't matter if your average is 80 or something. If your monitor cannot support that, it's not going to matter. Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think, or let me know if there's other games that you would like to see some benchmarks with the RTX 3080. And please don't forget to subscribe. This channel is mainly for gaming, so I have a ton of walkthroughs and sometimes tips and tricks or side quests of some of the games that I play myself. But there are tons of videos every day coming out, so please consider subscribing to the channel. Like the video if you liked it, and if you didn't, please let me know how I can improve. This is a new channel. Every comment, every suggestion would be much appreciated. And if you do like walkthroughs, ring the bell icon so you get notified of the next videos. As I said, every day there are going to be more episodes of, depending on the, you know, latest games. For example, you can find Cyberpunk, Assassin's Creed, also Immortals Phoenix Rising, which I just love. That game. It was really fun. There are a ton of, I'm going to be playing all the new games that I like, and if you have suggestions that you would like to see the walkthrough, definitely leave it in the comment sections, and I will try to get my hands on those games and find the time to do a walkthrough of those too. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video and it did help you to get some optimized settings and enjoy the game more. Until next time, take care everyone.